The sun had already beaten down on Ash Fork, Arizona, for 14 straight hours when Beatrice Brennan felt her knees buckle for the third time that afternoon, catching herself on the rough wooden fence post before she could collapse into the dust. It was July 1882, and the drought had stretched into its second merciless month, turning the already harsh desert landscape into something that felt more like punishment than providence. Every ranch within 50 miles was struggling, but the Brennan place had it worse than most since her father had died 6 weeks prior, leaving Beatrice and her younger sister Margaret to manage 40 head of cattle, 3 horses, and a property that seemed determined to crumble into nothing. Beatrice pushed her dark blonde hair away from her sweat-soaked forehead and forced her legs to carry her another 20 steps toward the well. The bucket felt like it was filled with stones instead of water, and her arms trembled with the effort of hauling it up. She was 22 years old but felt ancient, her body protesting every movement after days that started before dawn and ended long after sunset. There was no other choice. Margaret was only 17 and did her best, but she did not have the strength for the heavier work, and they could not afford to hire help. Every cent they had was going toward keeping the cattle alive and the mortgage paid. She had just managed to pour water into the trough when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching from the east. Beatrice straightened slowly, one hand pressed against her lower back, and squinted against the glare of the afternoon sun. A rider was coming up the long dirt road that led to their property, moving at an easy pace that suggested he was in no particular hurry. Her first instinct was wariness. A woman alone on a ranch was vulnerable in ways that kept her awake at night, though she kept her father's rifle loaded and within reach at all times. The rider drew closer, and Beatrice could make out more details. He sat tall in the saddle atop a sturdy paint horse, his hat pulled low against the sun. As he approached the fence line, he slowed to a stop and raised one hand in greeting, a gesture that seemed more respectful than threatening. Beatrice remained where she was, her exhaustion making it difficult to summon the energy for proper caution. "Afternoon, madam," the man called out, his voice carrying clearly across the dusty yard. "Name's Thomas Pierce. I'm looking for work, and I heard in town that the Brennan Ranch might need a hand." Beatrice stared at him, trying to process his words through the fog of fatigue that had settled over her mind. Thomas Pierce dismounted with fluid grace and stood beside his horse, making no move to come closer without invitation. He looked to be in his mid-20s, with sun-bronzed skin and dark brown hair that curled slightly at the edges beneath his hat. His clothes were worn but clean, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who knew his way around ranch work. "We cannot afford to hire anyone," Beatrice said, her voice coming out rougher than she intended. The words tasted bitter, an admission of failure she hated making to a stranger. Thomas was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes taking in the state of the property with an assessing gaze that was not unkind. Beatrice followed his line of sight and saw what he must be seeing. The sagging fence rails, the empty water troughs she had not yet gotten to, the scattered tools that needed to be put away, the general air of a place where too much work was being done by too few hands. "I can see you've got your hands full here," Thomas said carefully. "What if I worked for room and board for a spell, just until you get things sorted out? I've been on the trail a while, and a place to rest would be worth more to me right now than wages." Beatrice felt something dangerous flutter in her chest. Hope was a luxury she could not afford, and yet here it was, offering itself in the form of a stranger on horseback. Her practical side immediately raised objections. She did not know this man. He could be anyone, could want anything. But as she stood there in the blazing heat, Feeling her body sway slightly with exhaustion, she realized she was out of options. "Why would you do that?" she asked, suspicion making her voice sharp. "Nobody works for free." Thomas shifted his weight and his expression remained open and honest. "I've got my reasons for being in this part of Arizona, madam. Nothing bad, I promise you that. I had some trouble with a ranch foreman up north, nothing I did wrong, but it left me needing to move on. I'm looking for a fresh start, and I'm willing to work hard for it. Sometimes a man needs a place to land for a while, get his bearings. Seems like you might need help as much as I need a place to stay." The explanation was just specific enough to sound true without being so detailed that it raised more questions. Beatrice studied his face, looking for signs of dishonesty or ill intent, but all she saw was a tired man who looked like he had been riding for too long. She recognized the weariness in his eyes because she saw it in her own mirror every morning. "There's a small bunkhouse out back," she heard herself say, the words coming out before she had fully decided to speak them. "It needs cleaning, but it's sound. You would get 3 meals a day and a roof over your head. But I expect hard work, Mr. Pierce, and if I get even a hint that you're not trustworthy, you'll be gone before you can blink." Something that might have been relief passed across Thomas's face. "That's more than fair, madam. You won't regret it, I promise you that." Beatrice nodded slowly, then felt the world tilt sideways as another wave of dizziness washed over her. She grabbed for the fence post again, her vision swimming with dark spots. Suddenly Thomas was there, having moved faster than she would have thought possible, his hand gripping her elbow with firm but gentle support. "When's the last time you ate?" he asked, and there was concern in his voice that sounded genuine. "Or sat down for more than 5 minutes?" "I don't have time for sitting," Beatrice said, but even she could hear how weak her voice sounded. "There's too much work." "The work will still be here after you rest," Thomas said, and his tone was both practical and kind. "Come on, let's get you inside before you fall over." "Whatever needs doing can wait an hour." Beatrice wanted to argue, wanted to pull away and prove that she was fine, that she could handle everything on her own. But her body had reached its limit, and when Thomas gently guided her toward the house, she found herself leaning on his arm more than she would have liked. The few steps to the porch felt like miles, and by the time they reached the front door, she was breathing hard. Margaret appeared in the doorway, her blue eyes wide with alarm. "Bea, what happened?" "She's exhausted," Thomas said before Beatrice could respond. "When did she last eat?" Margaret's face flushed with guilt. "We had some bread this morning, but we've been so busy. I was going to make something for supper, but the stove is acting up again and I've been trying to fix it." Thomas helped Beatrice into the house, which was marginally cooler than the outside but still uncomfortably warm. The interior was clean but sparse, with furniture that had seen better days and walls that needed fresh paint. He guided her to a chair at the kitchen table, and then turned to Margaret with an expression that managed to be authoritative without being intimidating. "I'm Thomas Pierce, and your sister just hired me to help around the ranch. First thing I'm going to do is get her some food and water. Second thing is to look at that stove. After that, we'll figure out what else needs immediate attention. But right now, she needs to rest." Beatrice opened her mouth to protest, but Thomas fixed her with a look that was surprisingly firm. "Madam, I mean no disrespect, but you're going to work yourself into the ground if you keep going like this. You can't take care of this place if you can't stand up. So you're going to sit right there and rest while I handle things for a bit." There was something in his voice that reminded Beatrice of her father, a gentle authority that made arguing seem pointless. She slumped in the chair, feeling the weight of her exhaustion settling over her like a heavy blanket. Margaret was already moving toward the pump, fetching fresh water, while Thomas surveyed the kitchen with the same assessing gaze he had turned on the property outside. Within minutes, he had assessed the situation with the stove, determined that it just needed a good cleaning and adjustment, and set about fixing it with confident efficiency. Margaret brought Beatrice water, which she drank in long, grateful gulps, feeling the cool liquid ease the parched feeling in her throat. Thomas worked quickly, his hands sure and capable, and soon the stove was functioning properly again. "Now then," Thomas said, washing his hands at the pump. "What have you got for food?" Margaret showed him their meager supplies, which consisted mostly of flour, some salt pork, dried beans, and a few eggs from their struggling chickens. It was not much, but Thomas set to work without complaint, preparing a simple but filling meal with the efficiency of someone who had cooked for himself many times. The smell of frying salt pork filled the kitchen, and Beatrice felt her stomach clench with sudden, fierce hunger. When Thomas placed a plate in front of her, she wanted to tell him that he should not be serving her, that this was her house and she should be the one cooking. But the words would not come, and instead, she found herself eating with an eagerness that embarrassed her. The food was simple but well prepared, and she realized she had not had a proper meal in days. She had been so focused on keeping the ranch running that she had neglected her own basic needs. Thomas sat down across from her with his own plate, and Margaret joined them, looking between the two of them with an expression that was part hope, part uncertainty. For a few minutes, they ate in silence, the only sound the scrape of forks against plates and the ticking of the old clock on the wall. "Tell me about the ranch," Thomas said finally, looking at Beatrice. "What needs doing most urgently?" Beatrice set down her fork and tried to organize her thoughts. There was so much that needed attention that she hardly knew where to begin. The cattle need to be moved to the north pasture, where there's still some grass. The fences are falling apart in 3 different places. The well needs maintenance before it gives out completely. The barn roof is leaking. The horses need shoeing. We're behind on sorting out which calves need branding, and that's just what I can think of right now. Thomas listened carefully, nodding as she spoke. "All right. Tomorrow morning, we'll start with moving the cattle. That's the most important thing because without them, there's no ranch. After that, we'll work on the fences because if the cattle get out, we'll have bigger problems. The rest we can tackle as we go. But tonight, you're going to rest." No arguments. Beatrice felt a flicker of irritation at being told what to do in her own home, but it was overwhelmed by a wave of relief so intense it nearly brought tears to her eyes. For the first time since her father's death, someone else was sharing the burden. Someone else was making decisions and taking charge. She did not have to carry everything alone. "Thank you," she said quietly, and the words felt inadequate for what she was feeling. Thomas gave her a slight smile, the first real one she had seen from him. "No need for thanks. You gave me a place to stay, and I'm going to earn my keep. That's a fair exchange." After the meal, Thomas insisted on cleaning up while Beatrice sat and continued to rest. Margaret helped him, chattering nervously about the ranch and the town and anything else that came to mind. Beatrice watched them work, studying Thomas more carefully now that she had the energy for it. He moved with practiced ease, putting things away and asking where items belonged without any fuss. There was something calming about his presence, a steadiness that made her feel less frantic. When the kitchen was clean, Thomas excused himself to tend to his horse and check out the bunkhouse. Beatrice watched him go, then turned to find Margaret staring at her with barely contained excitement. "He seems really nice," Margaret said, keeping her voice low even though Thomas was well out of earshot. "And he's handsome, don't you think, Margaret?" Beatrice said warningly, but her sister just grinned. "I'm just saying. When was the last time you even looked at a man that way?" You're always so busy working that you never have time for anything else." "I don't have time for this conversation either," Beatrice said, but there was no heat in her words. The truth was that Thomas Pierce was attractive, and she had noticed, even through her exhaustion. But she could not afford to think about such things. She needed a worker, not a complication. That night, Beatrice went to bed earlier than she had in weeks, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she slept deeply and without anxiety. Knowing that there was someone else on the property, someone who would share the work, allowed her to finally let go of the constant vigilance that had been wearing her down to nothing. She woke before dawn, as always, but this time she felt more rested than she had in months. The house was quiet, and pale gray light was just beginning to show through the windows. Beatrice dressed quickly and headed outside, expecting to be the first one up. Instead, she found Thomas already in the barn, checking over the horses with careful attention. "Morning," he said, glancing up as she approached. "Figured I'd get an early start. These two need shoeing pretty badly, and this one has a stone bruise on his front left hoof. We'll need to keep an eye on that." Beatrice felt a mix of gratitude and embarrassment. She had known the horses needed attention, but had not had time to give them the careful examination they deserved. "I've been meaning to get to that." "I know you have," Thomas said, and there was no judgment in his voice. "You've been doing the work of 3 people. Something was bound to slip through. That's why I'm here now." They worked together through the morning, moving the cattle to the north pasture where the grazing was marginally better. It was hot, dusty work, but with 2 of them handling it, the job went much faster than it would have if Beatrice had been alone. Thomas clearly knew what he was doing, anticipating the cattle's movements and working his horse with skill that spoke of years of experience. By midday, when the sun was at its most brutal, they took a break in the shade of a cottonwood tree near the creek that ran through the property. The creek was lower than it should have been, another casualty of the drought, but there was still enough water flowing to provide some relief from the heat. Thomas pulled a canteen from his saddle and offered it to Beatrice first, a small gesture of courtesy that she appreciated. "You're good with cattle," she observed, taking a drink and then handing the canteen back. Thomas shrugged. "Been working ranches since I was 14. It's what I know." "What happened with your last job?" Beatrice asked, then immediately wondered if she was being too forward. But she wanted to know more about this man who had appeared so conveniently in her hour of need. Thomas was quiet for a moment, staring out at the creek. "The foreman and I had a disagreement about how the ranch should be run. He wanted to cut corners, treat the animals rough, work the hands too hard without proper compensation. I spoke up about it, and he didn't take kindly to that. Gave me a choice between keeping my mouth shut or moving on. I chose to move on." It was the kind of answer that made Beatrice respect him more. A man who stood up for what was right, even when it cost him, was rare in her experience. That must have been difficult. "It was the right thing to do," Thomas said simply. "I don't mind hard work, but I won't be part of something I don't believe in. Life's too short for that." They returned to work after the break, and the afternoon passed in steady labor. By the time evening approached, they had accomplished more than Beatrice would have managed in 3 days on her own. When they finally headed back to the house, she felt tired but satisfied. The good kind of tired that came from productive work rather than desperate scrambling. Over the next few weeks, a rhythm developed on the ranch. Thomas proved himself to be everything he had promised: hardworking, skilled, and reliable. He repaired fences, maintained equipment, tended to the animals, and tackled every job with steady competence. More importantly, he seemed to understand when Beatrice needed help and when she needed to do things herself. He never made her feel incompetent or incapable, but he also did not let her work herself into exhaustion again. Margaret blossomed under the new arrangement as well. With less pressure on her to handle tasks beyond her abilities, she found her own rhythm, managing the chickens, tending a small vegetable garden that was struggling in the heat, and keeping the house running. The three of them fell into an easy partnership that felt natural and right. As the days passed, Beatrice found herself increasingly aware of Thomas in ways that had nothing to do with his work ethic. She noticed the way the morning sun caught in his dark hair, the sound of his laugh when Margaret said something amusing, the gentle way he handled the horses. She noticed how his presence made her feel safer, how the knot of constant anxiety in her chest had loosened since he arrived. She tried not to think about it too much. Thomas was an employee, even if he was not taking wages. Getting involved with him would be complicated and potentially disastrous if things went wrong. Besides, she had no indication that he thought of her as anything more than the woman who had given him a place to stay. But then, there were moments that made her wonder. The way his hand would linger on hers when he passed her a tool, the concerned look in his eyes when he thought she was pushing herself too hard, the times she caught him watching her with an expression she could not quite read. One evening in early August, about 3 weeks after Thomas had arrived, Beatrice was in the barn finishing up the evening chores. She had sent Margaret to bed early because her sister had been feeling poorly all day. Nothing serious but enough to warrant rest. Thomas had ridden into town to pick up some supplies they needed, and she expected him back any time. She was just finishing filling the water buckets when she heard the sound of his horse outside. Beatrice stepped out of the barn to greet him and help unload the supplies, but the expression on Thomas's face stopped her. He looked troubled, his jaw tight with tension. "What's wrong?" she asked immediately. Thomas dismounted and began unloading packages from his saddlebags with movements that were just a bit too forceful. "I heard some talk in town about your father's death and the mortgage on this place." Beatrice felt her stomach clench with dread. "What kind of talk?" "Apparently there's a man named Gerald Morrison who's been telling people that he made your father a loan before he died, and now he's expecting you to pay it back with interest. Says if you can't pay, he'll have to take the ranch to settle the debt." The name hit Beatrice like a physical blow. Gerald Morrison was a wealthy rancher who owned property to the west of theirs. He had made several offers to buy the Brennan ranch over the years, offers that her father had always refused. She had not heard from him since her father's death, and had hoped that meant he had moved on to other interests. "My father would never have borrowed money from that man," Beatrice said, her voice shaking with anger and fear. "He hated Morrison. Said he was a cheat and a liar who would steal the ranch out from under us if he got half a chance." Thomas nodded slowly. "That's what I thought. But Morrison's telling everyone in town that he has a signed note and he's going to the territorial court to enforce it. Says you owe him $1,500 by the end of September, or he gets the property." $1,500 might as well have been $15,000. Beatrice barely had enough to cover the regular mortgage payment, let alone an additional debt. She felt the world tilting beneath her feet, all the progress of the past few weeks suddenly meaningless in the face of this new threat. "He's lying," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "He has to be lying." "Probably," Thomas agreed. "But if he's got a document that looks official, even if it's forged, it's going to be your word against his. And he's got money and influence in this territory. That counts for a lot." Beatrice felt tears of frustration burning in her eyes. She had worked so hard, sacrificed so much, and it still was not enough. Morrison was going to take everything, and there was nothing she could do to stop him. She turned away, not wanting Thomas to see her cry, but he was already there, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "Hey," he he said softly. "We're not giving up. There's got to be a way to fight this." "How?" Beatrice demanded, whirling to face him. "I don't have money for a lawyer. I don't have influence. I'm just a woman trying to hold onto her family's land, and men like Morrison always win. That's how the world works." Thomas's expression hardened with determination. "Not always. Not if we're smart about this. Tell me everything you know about Morrison and his dealings with your father." They spent the next hour going through everything Beatrice could remember. Her father had kept careful records, and she retrieved his ledger books from the house. They went through them page by the light of a lantern, looking for any mention of Morrison or any unexplained transactions. There was nothing. Every payment, every expense, every sale was meticulously documented, and there was no record of any loan from Gerald Morrison. "This is good," Thomas said, tapping the ledger books. "These show that your father was careful with money and kept detailed records. If there was a legitimate loan, he would have written it down. The fact that there's nothing here is evidence that Morrison's lying." "But it's not proof," Beatrice said wearily. "It just shows what's not in the books, not what actually happened." Thomas was quiet for a moment, thinking. "What if we could prove that the document Morrison has is a forgery? If we could show that your father's signature was faked, that would destroy his case." "How would we do that? Does the bank have any documents with your father's signature? Loan papers, account records, anything like that?" Beatrice nodded slowly. "Yes, the original mortgage papers are at the bank, and he had a savings account there. All of those would have his signature. Then we get copies of those signatures and compare them to whatever Morrison produces. If they don't match, we've got him." It was a plan, but Beatrice could see the flaws in it immediately. Morrison won't just hand over his supposed loan document for us to examine, and even if we could prove it's a forgery, who's going to believe us over him? "Let me worry about that," Thomas said, and there was something in his voice that made Beatrice look at him more closely. "I know some people, have some connections from my time working other ranches. There are men who owe me favors, and I'm not afraid to call them in." "Why would you do this?" Beatrice asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't your fight. You could just move on to another ranch, find work somewhere else without all this trouble." Thomas reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers with warmth that seemed to spread through her whole body. "Because I don't want to be anywhere else. Because this ranch and you and Margaret, you've become important to me. Because when I see you working yourself to exhaustion, trying to hold onto your family's legacy, it makes me want to fight beside you. That's why." Beatrice stared at him, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The lantern light cast shadows across his face, but his eyes were steady and sincere. She realized that somewhere in the past few weeks, without her quite noticing when or how, Thomas Pierce had become essential to her life. Not just as a worker, not just as someone who shared the burden, but as something much more profound. "Thomas," she said, and his name felt different on her lips now, weighted with meaning it had not carried before. He squeezed her hand gently. "I know we've only known each other a short while. And I know I came here as someone looking for work, nothing more. But things have changed for me, Beatrice. You've changed things for me. I want to stay here, not just until the work is done or until I've earned my keep, but permanently, if you'll have me." The words hung in the air between them, a confession and a question and a promise all at once. Beatrice felt her breath catch in her throat. She knew she should be cautious, should think carefully about what he was saying and what it meant. But the truth was that her heart had already made the decision. Thomas had shown her who he was through his actions over the past weeks. He was kind and hardworking and steady, everything she had ever wanted in a partner, but had stopped believing she would find. "I want that too," she said, and felt the truth of it resonating through her bones. "I want you to stay." Thomas smiled, a full, genuine smile that transformed his entire face, making him look younger and happier. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles with old-fashioned courtesy that made her heart flutter. "Then I'll stay. And together, we'll figure out how to beat Morrison and keep this ranch in your family where it belongs." The next morning, Thomas rode into Ash Fork at first light. He was gone for most of the day, and Beatrice tried to focus on her work, but found her thoughts constantly wandering. Margaret noticed her distraction and teased her about it gently, clearly delighted by the developing romance between her sister and the cowboy who had so providentially appeared in their lives. When Thomas finally returned in the late afternoon, he was not alone. With him was an older man with gray hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. Thomas introduced him as Judge William Hartford, a territorial judge who happened to be passing through the region. "Thomas tells me you're having some trouble with a man claiming your father owed him money," Judge Hartford said, settling himself in the parlor with the air of someone accustomed to authority. "I'd like to hear your side of the story." Beatrice went through everything, showing the judge her father's meticulous records and explaining their history with Morrison. Judge Hartford listened carefully, asking occasional questions and making notes in a small leather-bound book. When she finished, he sat back and studied her with an expression that was difficult to read. "You understand that without seeing Morrison's supposed loan document, I cannot make any official judgments," the judge said. "However, from what you've shown me, your father appears to have been a careful and honest man. The fact that there's no record of this loan in his books is significant. Tell me, has Morrison filed his claim with the territorial court yet?" "I don't know," Beatrice admitted. "Thomas only heard about it yesterday in town." Judge Hartford nodded thoughtfully. "I'm going to make some inquiries. If Morrison does file a claim, it will have to come through proper legal channels, and I can ensure that you get a fair hearing. In the meantime, I suggest you gather every document you have that bears your father's signature. If this goes to court, we'll need to be able to prove forgery if that's indeed what Morrison has done." Over the next 2 weeks, Beatrice and Thomas worked to prepare their case while also keeping up with the demands of the ranch. Margaret helped by going through old family papers, finding letters and documents that their father had signed. They collected everything at the bank, getting certified copies of the mortgage papers and account records. During this time, Beatrice and Thomas grew closer in ways that went beyond their shared fight against Morrison. They worked side by side during the day, but in the evenings, they found time to talk, really talk about their lives and dreams and fears. Beatrice learned that Thomas had grown up in Texas, the youngest of 5 children. His father had been a cattleman who taught him everything about ranching before dying when Thomas was 19. He had been drifting from job to job ever since, never quite finding a place that felt like home until he arrived at the Brennan Ranch. Thomas learned that Beatrice had always loved the ranch, even as a child. While other girls had dreamed of leaving for the city or finding wealthy husbands, she had wanted nothing more than to stay on the land her grandparents had claimed. Her father had encouraged her, teaching her everything about running a ranch, treating her like the son he never had. His death had devastated her, not just because of the loss, but because it had left her responsible for preserving his legacy. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert sky in shades of orange and red, Thomas took her hand and said, "Whatever happens with Morrison, whatever the future holds, I want you to know that I love you, Beatrice Brennan. I've loved you since the day I saw you nearly collapse from exhaustion and realized what kind of strength it takes to keep going the way you have. You're the bravest woman I've ever met, and I'd be honored to spend my life beside you." Beatrice felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were happy tears, tears of relief and joy. "I love you too, Thomas. I didn't think I had room in my life for love, not with everything else I was dealing with. But you made room. You came into my life and made everything better just by being here." Thomas leaned in and kissed her, gentle and sweet and full of promise. When they pulled apart, Beatrice saw her own happiness reflected in his eyes. For the first time since her father's death, she felt truly hopeful about the future. The confrontation with Morrison came sooner than expected. One morning in mid-August, he rode up to the ranch with 2 hired men flanking him. Morrison was a large man in his 50s, with cold blue eyes and an air of entitlement that made Beatrice's skin crawl. He dismounted with the confidence of someone who believed he had already won. "Miss Brennan," he said, removing his hat in a mockery of courtesy, "I've come to discuss the matter of your father's debt to me." "My father owed you nothing," Beatrice said firmly, standing on the porch with Thomas beside her. She had known this moment would come and had prepared herself for it. Morrison smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression. "I have a promissory note that says otherwise. $1,500, due at the time of his death or 30 days thereafter. That time has well passed. I'm prepared to be reasonable, however. Sign the ranch over to me and I'll forgive the debt. You and your sister can stay on as tenants if you like." "Let's see this promissory note," Thomas said, his voice hard. Morrison pulled a folded paper from his jacket and handed it over with an air of triumph. Thomas examined it carefully, and Beatrice looked over his shoulder. The document appeared official, with her father's name and a signature at the bottom. But as she looked at the signature, her heart lifted. It was close to her father's handwriting, but not quite right. The loops were too large, the slant slightly off. "This is a forgery," Beatrice said loudly, clearly. "That's not my father's signature." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Brennan. Do you have any proof?" "As a matter of fact, we do," said a new voice. Judge Hartford rode into the yard, accompanied by the county sheriff. "I've been investigating your claims, Mr. Morrison, and I've found some interesting information. You've tried this same scheme before in 2 other territories, using forged documents to claim property from vulnerable owners. I have statements from witnesses who saw you attempting to forge signatures in a saloon in Tucson 3 months ago." Morrison's face went pale, then red with fury. "You have no authority here, Hartford. This is a private matter." "Actually, forgery and fraud are criminal matters, which gives me all the authority I need," Judge Hartford said calmly. "Sheriff, please take Mr. Morrison into custody. He'll be held pending trial for fraud and attempted theft." The next few minutes were chaotic. Morrison blustered and threatened while his hired men backed away, clearly wanting no part of what was happening. The sheriff placed Morrison in handcuffs and led him away, still protesting his innocence. Judge Hartford stayed behind to speak with Beatrice and Thomas. "That promissory note will be entered into evidence at the trial, and I have no doubt it will be proven a forgery," the judge said. "You won't have any more trouble from Morrison. He'll be lucky if he avoids prison time." "Thank you," Beatrice said, feeling weak with relief. "I don't know how to repay you for this." Judge Hartford smiled. "Thank Thomas. He's the one who tracked me down and convinced me to investigate. He also called in some favors from people who knew about Morrison's past activities. You've got a good man there, Miss Brennan. I suggest you hold on to him." After the judge left, Beatrice turned to Thomas with wonder. "You did all of that, found the judge, investigated Morrison, gathered evidence?" Thomas looked slightly embarrassed. "I told you I had connections. I wasn't about to let that man steal your ranch. You and Margaret have worked too hard, and your father's memory deserves better than that." Beatrice threw her arms around him, holding him tight. You saved us. You saved everything. We saved it together, Thomas corrected gently, holding her close. You were the one who kept this place going when anyone else would have given up. I just helped even out the odds. With the threat from Morrison eliminated, life on the ranch settled into a new normal. The summer heat eventually broke, and fall arrived with cooler temperatures and, mercifully, some rain. The drought ended and the land began to recover. The cattle fattened up, the grass grew green again, and the ranch started to feel prosperous rather than desperate. In October, Thomas proposed to Beatrice properly, with a ring he had saved up to buy despite not taking wages. It was a simple gold band with a small diamond, nothing extravagant, but to Beatrice, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She said yes immediately, and they were married the following month in a small ceremony at the church in Ash Fork. Margaret served as maid of honor, crying happy tears throughout the entire service. They held the wedding breakfast at the ranch, with neighbors and friends from town coming to celebrate. It was a joyful occasion, full of laughter and music and dancing. As Beatrice danced with her new husband under the clear Arizona sky, she felt a happiness so complete it almost frightened her. "Are you happy?" Thomas asked, as if reading her thoughts. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Beatrice admitted. "Sometimes I can't believe this is real, that you're real." "I'm real," Thomas assured her, pulling her closer, "and I'm not going anywhere. This is where I belong, with you on this ranch, building a life together." The first year of their marriage was busy and productive. They worked together to improve the ranch, adding to the herd, repairing buildings, making plans for the future. Margaret met a young man from town, a schoolteacher named David, who courted her properly and won her heart. By the following spring, Margaret was engaged as well, planning a summer wedding of her own. "Are you sure you're ready to see her married and moved away?" Thomas asked Beatrice one evening as they discussed Margaret's upcoming wedding. "She'll only be in town, not far at all," Beatrice said. "And yes, I'm ready. She deserves her own happiness, her own life. Besides, I have you. I'm not alone anymore." In the summer of 1883, Margaret married David in a ceremony even lovelier than Beatrice's had been. The newlyweds moved into a small house in Ash Fork, where David continued teaching, and Margaret became involved in various town activities. She visited the ranch often, and Beatrice visited town regularly, keeping the bond between the sisters strong despite their new separate lives. That fall, Beatrice discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with a mixture of joy and anxiety. She had always wanted children, but the timing felt both perfect and terrifying. Thomas was elated, immediately becoming protective and attentive in ways that were both endearing and occasionally frustrating. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," Beatrice told him one morning when he tried to keep her from helping with the morning chores. "I know," Thomas said, looking sheepish. "I just want to take care of you. Let me do the heavy work at least." They compromised, with Beatrice continuing to be involved in running the ranch, but letting Thomas handle the more physically demanding tasks. As winter approached and her pregnancy progressed, she found herself content to spend more time on administrative work, managing the books and planning for the future. Their son was born in April of 1884, during a warm spring that promised good things for the coming year. They named him Robert Thomas Pierce, after both of their fathers. He was a healthy baby with dark hair like his father and blue eyes that might, the doctor said, eventually change to brown. Holding her son for the first time, Beatrice felt overwhelmed by love and gratitude. She thought about the day Thomas had ridden up to the ranch, nearly 2 years ago now, when she had been exhausted and desperate and running out of hope. She thought about how he had gently taken her hand and insisted she rest, how he had fought for her and her ranch, how he had loved her when she had not believed she had time for love. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked softly, sitting beside her bed and looking at his son with wonder. "I'm thinking about how lucky I am," Beatrice said. "How lucky we are. 2 years ago I thought I was going to lose everything. Now I have more than I ever dreamed possible." Thomas took her free hand and kissed it gently. "I'm the lucky one. I was drifting, looking for something I couldn't name. Then I found you, and suddenly everything made sense. You gave me a home, a purpose, a family. You gave me everything that matters." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching their son sleep, each thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. Outside, the spring rain fell gently on the Arizona desert, bringing life to the land and promise to the future. The years that followed were good ones. The ranch prospered under their joint management, growing from a struggling operation into one of the most successful in the region. They hired additional hands as the herd grew, treating their workers fairly and earning a reputation as good employers. Thomas's instincts about cattle and ranching proved sound time and again, while Beatrice's careful management of finances kept them on solid footing even in difficult years. Robert grew into a sturdy, cheerful boy who loved the ranch as much as his mother did. He was barely 2 years old when Beatrice became pregnant again, and in early 1887 they welcomed a daughter they named Sarah Ann. Sarah had her mother's blonde hair and her father's dark eyes, and from the beginning she was a determined, spirited child who kept them all on their toes. Margaret and David had children as well, 2 daughters who were close in age to Robert and Sarah. The cousins played together often, and family gatherings became a regular and cherished part of their lives. The small family that had once been just Beatrice and Margaret, struggling to survive, had grown into something large and joyful and strong. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Thomas surprised Beatrice with a gift. He led her outside after supper to find a newly built gazebo near the house, positioned to catch the evening breeze and provide a view of the sunset over the desert. "I wanted to give you a place to rest," he said, echoing the words that had become something of a private joke between them. "A place where you can sit down without worrying about all the work that needs doing." Beatrice laughed and cried at the same time, throwing her arms around her husband. "It's perfect. You're perfect." "Not perfect," Thomas corrected, holding her close, "but trying my best to be worthy of you." They sat together in the gazebo as the sun set, watching their children play in the yard while the evening turned the sky shades of gold and crimson. The air was warm and still, carrying the scent of sage and the distant sound of cattle lowing in the pasture. Everything was peaceful, everything was right. "You remember the day we met?" Beatrice asked, her head resting on Thomas's shoulder. "Every detail," Thomas said. "I remember thinking that I had never seen anyone work so hard or look so tired. I remember wanting to help you before I even knew your name." "I was so stubborn about accepting help," Beatrice said with a slight laugh. "I thought I had to do everything myself, prove that I could manage alone." "You could have managed alone," Thomas said seriously. "You would have found a way. You're strong enough for anything. But I'm glad you didn't have to. I'm glad you let me stay, let me help, let me love you." "I'm glad too," Beatrice said softly. "You took my hand and told me to rest, and in doing so, you gave me back my life. You gave me everything I needed but was too proud or too scared to ask for." They watched as Robert tried to teach little Sarah how to throw a ball, the 2-year-old more interested in chasing after it than catching it. The scene was domestic and ordinary and absolutely precious. This was the life Beatrice had fought so hard to preserve, and it was richer and fuller than she had ever imagined it could be. As the years continued to pass, the ranch became even more successful. By 1890, the The Pierce Ranch, as it was now known, was one of the largest cattle operations in northern Arizona. They had weathered droughts and hard winters, market fluctuations, and all the various challenges that came with ranching. Through it all, Beatrice and Thomas had worked together, their partnership strengthening with each passing year. Robert grew into a capable young man who loved ranching and showed every sign of being ready to take over the operation someday. Sarah, true to her spirited nature, announced at age 10 that she wanted to be a veterinarian, an ambitious goal for a girl but one that her parents supported wholeheartedly. They began planning for her education, determined that she would have every opportunity to pursue her dreams. In 1892, Beatrice gave birth to their third and final child, another son they named James William. Jamie, as he quickly became known, completed their family in a way that felt perfectly right. He was a sweet-natured baby who grew into an affectionate child, the one most likely to bring wildflowers to his mother or help his father with chores without being asked. Margaret and David's family had grown as well, and the extended family gatherings had become large, boisterous affairs, full of laughter and love. On holidays, the ranch house was packed with people, and Beatrice often found herself thinking how empty and quiet it had once been, back in those desperate days before Thomas arrived. One evening in the fall of 1895, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Beatrice and Thomas sat together on the porch swing he had built for her 40th birthday. She was feeling nostalgic, thinking about how much had changed over the years. 13 years, she said wonderingly. It's been 13 years since you rode up to this ranch and changed my life. Thomas put his arm around her, pulling her close. Best decision I ever made, offering to work for room and board. I got so much more than I bargained for. So did I, Beatrice agreed. I thought I was hiring help. Instead, I found my partner, my love, my whole world. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the desert and the occasional call of a night bird. The moon was rising over the eastern horizon, casting silver light across the land they had worked so hard to build and maintain. You ever think about how things might have gone if I hadn't shown up that day? Thomas asked thoughtfully. Would you have made it through? Beatrice considered the question seriously. Maybe. I like to think I would have found a way, but it would have been so much harder and I would have been so much lonelier. You didn't just save the ranch, Thomas. You saved me. You saw me working myself to exhaustion and you took my hand and said, "Rest with me." Those were the most important words anyone has ever said to me. I meant them then, and I mean them now, Thomas said. Rest with me, build with me, dream with me, grow old with me. All of it for the rest of our lives. Yes, Beatrice said simply. To all of it, yes. The years continued their steady march forward, bringing both joys and challenges. Robert married a young woman from Flagstaff in 1898, bringing her home to the ranch and beginning to take on more responsibility for managing the operation. Sarah, determined as ever, left for college in California in 1900 to pursue her dream of becoming a veterinarian, one of only a handful of women in her program. Jamie grew into a thoughtful young man with a gift for numbers and a head for business, proving invaluable in managing the financial side of the ranch. Thomas and Beatrice settled into their roles as the elder generation, still active and involved, but gradually passing more responsibility to their children. They took pleasure in watching their family grow and thrive, in seeing the next generation take up the work they had dedicated their lives to. In 1902, Robert and his wife made them grandparents for the first time, with a grandson they named Thomas Robert Pierce, continuing the family tradition of honoring those who came before. Beatrice held her grandson, and felt the circle of life completing itself in a way that was both poignant and deeply satisfying. Margaret's children were grown as well, pursuing their own paths and dreams. The two sisters, now in their 40s, remained as close as they had been in their youth, meeting regularly for coffee and conversation. They often reminisced about those hard years after their father's death, marveling at how far they had come. "You remember how scared we were?" Margaret asked during one of these visits. "How we thought we were going to lose everything." "I remember," Beatrice said. "I also remember the day Thomas showed up and everything started to change. I was so tired, Maggie, so tired I could barely stand. And he took my hand and made me rest, and it was like he gave me permission to be human again, to need help, to not carry everything alone." "He loves you so much," Margaret said with a soft smile. "Always has from that first day. I saw it even before you did." "I know," Beatrice said. "And I love him the same way. He's been my partner in everything, my support and my strength. We built this life together, and it's been better than anything I could have imagined on my own." As the new century progressed, the ranch continued to thrive. The cattle business had its ups and downs, but careful management and good planning kept them prosperous, even in difficult years. The family grew with the addition of more grandchildren, and the ranch house was expanded to accommodate the growing family for holidays and special occasions. In 1905, on their 20th wedding anniversary, Thomas took Beatrice back to the gazebo he had built for her so many years before. It had been maintained and improved over the years, and now climbing roses grew up its sides, filling the air with their sweet scent. 20 years, Thomas said, taking both her hands in his. "It's gone by so fast. It feels like just yesterday I was a drifter on horseback looking for a place to belong." "And now?" Beatrice asked, though she knew the answer. "Now I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, with exactly who I'm supposed to be with," Thomas said. "You've given me everything I ever wanted and things I didn't even know I needed. A home, a family, a purpose. You've made me happier than I ever thought possible." "You did the same for me," Beatrice said, reaching up to touch his face with gentle fingers. The years had added lines and silver to both of them, but when she looked at Thomas, she still saw the man who had offered her rest when she needed it most. "I was drowning and you threw me a lifeline. You showed me that I didn't have to be strong alone, that letting someone help wasn't weakness but wisdom." They renewed their vows that day, surrounded by family and friends, speaking words of love and commitment that were even more meaningful than they had been the first time. The years had tested them in ways they could not have anticipated, but they had weathered every storm together, and their love had only grown stronger. Sarah came home from veterinary school that same year, having completed her training and ready to start her practice. She set up an office in Ash Fork and quickly became known as an excellent veterinarian, winning over even the skeptics who doubted a woman could do the work. Thomas and Beatrice could not have been more proud of their daughter's determination and success. Jamie decided to study law, heading east to school with his parents' blessing and support. He returned several years later with a degree and a wife, a kind woman from Boston who adapted to life in Arizona with grace and good humor. He set up a law practice in Ash Fork and became known for his fair dealing and honest work. By 1910, Thomas and Beatrice were in their 50s, still healthy and active but content to let the younger generation take the lead on the ranch. Robert had proven himself more than capable of managing the operation, and with Jamie handling the legal and business affairs, the ranch was in good hands. Thomas and Beatrice spent more time together now, taking rides across the property they had built together, reminiscing and planning and simply enjoying each other's company. They traveled a bit, visiting Sarah in her practice and Jamie in his office, seeing parts of the territory they had never had time to explore before. One spring morning in 1912, 30 years after Thomas had first arrived at the ranch, they took a ride out to the north pasture where they had worked together on his first day. The land was green with spring grass, and cattle grazed peacefully across the hills. They dismounted and sat together on a flat rock, looking out over the vista. "This is what we fought for," Beatrice said, gesturing at the thriving ranch spread out before them. "This is what you saved when you helped me all those years ago." "We saved it together," Thomas corrected, as he always did. "I might have helped even out the odds, but you were the one with the will to keep fighting. I just made sure you didn't have to fight alone." "Do you remember what you said to me that first day?" Beatrice asked, though she knew he did. "After I nearly collapsed when you helped me inside." "I said the work would still be there after you rested," Thomas replied. "I told you to rest with me." "You've been saying that to me in one way or another for 30 years, Beatrice said with a tender smile. "Rest with me, build with me, stay with me, and every time it's been the best advice anyone could give me." Thomas pulled her close, and they sat together in the warm spring sun, watching the cattle and the land and the life they had built together. After a while, Thomas spoke again, his voice soft and thoughtful. "I think about that day sometimes, wonder what would have happened if I had ridden past this ranch instead of stopping. I was tired and looking for work, and I could have kept going to the next place or the one after that. But something told me to stop here, to offer my help to the exhausted woman I saw trying to do too much alone. It was like fate put me exactly where I needed to be." "I believe it was fate," Beatrice said. "I needed you, even though I didn't realize it. I needed someone who would see past my stubbornness and pride, someone who would insist I take care of myself even when I thought I didn't have time. You saw me, really saw me, and you stayed. That changed everything." They remained on the rock for a long time, holding hands and watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across the pasture. Eventually, they rode back to the house, where their family was gathering for Sunday dinner. The house was full of noise and laughter, grandchildren running through the rooms, and the wonderful smells of cooking food filling the air. As Beatrice stood in the doorway watching her family, Thomas came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. She leaned back against him, feeling the solid warmth of his body and the steady beat of his heart. "Happy," he murmured into her hair. "So happy," Beatrice replied. "More than I ever dreamed possible. You gave me this, Thomas, all of this. The family, the ranch, the life. You gave me everything." "You gave me the same," Thomas said. "A home, a purpose, a reason to wake up every morning grateful to be alive. I love you, Beatrice Pierce. I've loved you since the day I met you, and I'll love you until the day I die." "And I love you," Beatrice said, turning in his arms to face him. "Thank you for stopping at my ranch that day. Thank you for seeing that I needed help. Thank you for taking my hand and showing me that rest wasn't weakness but necessary. Thank you for building this life with me." They kissed, long and sweet and full of 3 decades of love and partnership. Around them, their family continued their celebration. But for that moment, it was just the two of them, the cowboy and the exhausted rancher's daughter who had found each other at exactly the right time. The years continued, bringing the usual mixture of joy and sorrow that accompanies any long life. They lost friends and eventually Margaret, who passed peacefully in 1920 surrounded by her family. Thomas and Beatrice mourned her deeply, but found comfort in each other, and in the knowledge that she had lived a full and happy life. Their children thrived, and their grandchildren grew up strong and capable. The ranch continued to prosper, adapting to changing times while maintaining the core values that Thomas and Beatrice had instilled. Fair treatment of workers, careful stewardship of the land, and dedication to quality over quick profit kept the Pierce Ranch respected throughout the territory and later the state, after Arizona achieved statehood in 1912. In their later years, Thomas and Beatrice settled into a comfortable routine, spending their days in each other's company and enjoying the fruits of their long labor. They took walks in the evening, sat together on the porch, and reminisced about their life together. The love between them, forged in those early desperate days and strengthened through years of partnership, remained as strong as ever. On a warm evening in the spring of 1927, 45 years after Thomas had first ridden up to the Brennan Ranch, they sat together in the gazebo he had built so long ago. They were in their 60s now, their hair silver and their movements slower, but the connection between them was as vital and real as it had ever been. 45 years, Beatrice said wonderingly, holding Thomas's hand. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime, and sometimes it feels like no time at all. The best 45 years anyone could ask for, Thomas said. Every day with you has been a gift, Beatrice. Even the hard days, even the days when we struggled and worried and wondered if we would make it through. Because we made it through together, and that made all the difference. You made all the difference, Beatrice corrected gently. You came into my life when I was at my lowest point and you lifted me up. You gave me strength when I had none left. You reminded me that I didn't have to carry everything alone. That's the greatest gift anyone has ever given me. As the sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and red, Thomas and Beatrice sat together in the gathering twilight. Around them, the ranch they had built together hummed with quiet life. Their great-grandchildren played in the yard, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. The cattle lowed softly in the distance. Everything was peaceful, everything was right. No regrets, Thomas asked softly. Not a single one, Beatrice replied with absolute certainty. This life with you, it's been everything I ever wanted and more than I knew to dream of. You took my hand that first day and said, "Rest with me," and I've been resting with you ever since. Not resting from work or responsibility, but resting in the knowledge that I'm not alone, that I'm loved, that I have a partner who will stand beside me no matter what comes. That's the greatest comfort anyone could have. Thomas raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, just as he had done so many times over the years. And I'll stand beside you for whatever time we have left, and then beyond that if there's any justice in the universe. You're my heart, Beatrice. You always have been and you always will be. They sat together as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, holding hands and watching their family and feeling the deep satisfaction that comes from a life well lived and a love well earned. The journey that had begun with an exhausted woman and a drifting cowboy had led to this: a thriving ranch, a loving family, and a partnership that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger for it. The night grew cooler, and eventually they rose from the gazebo and walked slowly back to the house, arm in arm, supporting each other as they had done for 45 years. Inside, the lamps were lit, and their family waited, ready to share the evening meal and the warm companionship that had always characterized the Pierce household. As they sat down to dinner, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, Beatrice caught Thomas's eye across the table. He smiled at her, that same warm, genuine smile that had captured her heart all those years ago. She smiled back, her heart full of gratitude and love. This was the life they had built together, the legacy they would leave behind. Not just a successful ranch or a large family, but a testament to what two people could accomplish when they loved each other, supported each other, and faced the world as partners. Thomas had taken her hand when she was working herself to exhaustion and told her to rest with him. In doing so, he had given her not just rest but renewed purpose, not just help but love, not just partnership but a lifetime of happiness. The years had been kind to them, and they had been kind to each other. As they sat together at the dinner table, surrounded by the evidence of their love and labor, Thomas and Beatrice Pierce knew that they had been blessed beyond measure. The cowboy had found her working herself to exhaustion, took her hand, and said, "Rest with me." And in that simple gesture, he had changed both their lives forever, creating a story of love and partnership that would echo through generations to come.